That is not what I'm talking about.
This is our symbolism. This is our symbolism of the coexistence, right? Of colorblindness, anti-racism, multiculturalism, and overt white supremacy.
We just, we were noticing again, as we were saying, we began this project during the Obama era and were very attentive to discourses of Black exceptionalism and so on. But this was also occurring at the same time as people were raising attention about state-sanctioned violence, torture, and brutality in the name of police killings of Black and brown and other peoples. We were also seeing the beginnings of a Black Lives Matter movement. But at the same time, the Obama presidency and the presumption of Black exceptionalism reinforced an existing discourse about behavioralism, right? Why can't other Black people be like Obama, right? Why can't you? If he could, then certainly anybody could. So again, while, as we were saying, there's a process of incorporation, but there's also ways that the discourses, existing discourses around Black pathology can still operate, even though we had, right, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, 1 Black man in the White House, 2 million, right, in the big house. So the transition from Obama to Trump, bumpy, but we're seeing how a lot of those discourses were providing a pathway for what we're seeing today.
All right, so unlike the previous slides, I'll be speaking to how the poetic work as well as the community organizing work has been central to Antiracism Inc. since the program's inception in 2012. So, how does a poem stop a prison from being built? This is a question that the Antiracism Inc. Collective has been asking most recently in Dr. Blake's TED Talk, so just saying. But what that question really is getting at is the link between the carceral and the cultural, or the structural and the stories, right? And how and why the stories matter. Because what we know is that we have massive amounts of evidence and data and statistics, but that fails to make a difference in people's hearts, right? Which have to be changed in order for the mind to make a shift or a subtle transformation. So that question guides our work and our thinking because the poetic matters, right? And is also central to the organizing. Because here's the thing. So you have this, burning house of global racial capitalism, and you can sit around and you can put out fires all day, but right, you have to build a new structure. And so that involves the imagination, creativity, new language, images, to really think through, how do we want to organize social life differently, right? Because we know that the terms that have been meted out by power are spiritually bankrupt. So how do we do the work? So we had a lot of events. We had an event, I'll be showing a clip in just a minute, from our poetic interventions. But I wanted to just propose, before I get into the specifics of the events, just sort of 4, I'll call them poetic propositions that kind of come out of the work of, the creative. So with that, the first proposition is that being critical is not inherently oppositional, right? So Rebel Diaz and Paula would always quote this, don't just oppose, propose. So there's a real tendency now on the, especially on the sort of, progressive left, is to critique everything to death. But, right, sort of like, well, okay, where were you with the community organizing meeting last night? Because we're trying to do stuff, right? So it's to move beyond critique to action. So, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, right, to have an energetic expectation of liberation, and to really think about, right, how we can move from the ink, right, the incorporation of anti-racist language and strategies, to the work. So how we really make stuff happen on the ground in our communities and fight for change. So we don't give up, right? A generative analysis should produce hope. And that's always, right, what the poetry reminds us, is to always imagine otherwise. So that's proposition 1. Proposition 2 is then moving beyond critique to action. So, Gramsci's philosophy of practice. So, we need to talk, we need to socialize, we need to think together, but then we need to, make decisions and act collectively. And coalition work does, require compromise. So, what we call non-reformist reforms can be part of a strategy for abolition, for example, right? So, you can work strategically without actually sort of sacrificing one's own ethical imperatives. So, it's a process, right? The Black radical imagination is not a thing, it's a constant reinvention and a constant doing. Proposition 3 is to resist the neoliberal insistence on the new, right? So even Clyde Woods talked about, what's all this business about neoliberalism? Can we keep talking about plantation capitalism, right? So there's this tendency to make everything new, and sexy and exciting, but really it's always to look at the movement legacies, what they teach us, and really to look at that ongoing struggle, right, which of course is itself a transformation, but resist this sort of temptation to brand everything and make everything new, right, always looking at, right, what has come before in this sort of chaos of history. And then the fourth proposition is the ink and the works as a dialectic in thinking. And so actually with that, I wanted to take an opportunity to briefly explain the handouts. So you'll see we'll be each speaking to one of the sections of the book. There's 4 sections for the first 3, and then at the end for the radical justice, social justice practice, we'll come back together and think collectively. But each section has an ink and a works. So the ink is an opportunity for you to just jot down notes. So again, we'll have an opportunity to have a collective conversation at the end of our presentation. But the ink is an opportunity for you to think about what are some examples of incorporation that you've noticed or found, right? When, it's sort of like you're having a conversation, and I'll be speaking more to the co-optation of the language of diversity and free speech, and et cetera, during the educational strategy section. But, it's sort of how can you make sense of, when the terms have been so thoroughly co-opted, you're having a totally different conversation. So if you're thinking of an example of the incorporation, something where something purports to be or claims to be anti-racist, but is anything but, just jot down a note, from popular culture, from, your studies, whatever it may be. And then the works is really thinking about, what do we do? So again, that poetic imagination. How might we dream, otherwise, amidst the defanging of, radical praxis and movements? How do we still continue to imagine otherwise? So that's what the handout is about and is related to the ink and the works. And I also wanted to say that we had a series of activist encounters on campus, as well as this poetic interventions, and that led to the formation of a coalition here on campus. It's also community-based, called the Coalition for Sustainable Communities. And I remember when we were, planning and scheming and dreaming together, we explicitly had a discussion about we don't want to be, anti. We're not anti. Of course, we're anti things, anti-prisons, consenting to human caging, all of this. But we want it to be for something, not just against it. So that's an example of how our sort of thinking as a collective actually was solidified in praxis. And we did a number of events. There was an Earth Day campaign, and so we had the motto that critical resistance and curb have used. The jails are toxic, but we wanted to really show the community that, as we know, the more money is invested in the carceral, right, the less money is invested in the community resources that we actually need to actually keep us safe.